So, as usual. So we're going to apply this space. We have a lot of our friends online. I think there's 40, 50 online, hopefully, to provide a space for UN stakeholders and representatives to reflect on their own well-being and mental health in the context of their work. And secondly, to explore the connection between climate, health, sustainable development, and global resilience. And thirdly, to advocate for holistic approaches which centre and optimise the health and well-being of people and the environment. I think we've put together an excellent panel, and some of them are here in the room and others are online. So I just want to warmly welcome everyone here today. And I hand over to Liana, who's going to moderate the session.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you to everyone who's here in person and online. To reiterate, my name is Liana Almany, and I'm the Executive Assistant and Assistant Representative to the UN with UNANIMA International. We know it's a busy time at the UN this week with many overlapping programs and events, so we are very grateful for each and every one of you for being here for this parallel event alongside the first ever UN General Assembly Sustainability Week on holistic approaches for a sustainable future, centering individual, collective, and planetary well-being. So let me start by providing some context on UNGA Sustainability Week. At COP28, as Jean mentioned, the President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Dennis Francis, announced his plan to convene UNGA Sustainability Week in April 2024. The week will consolidate already mandated events towards the reduction of our global energy dependency, mainly focused on sectors like tourism, transport, and infrastructure. The results of the week are meant to add further momentum to the path laid out at COP28 and at the SDGs Summit in September 2023, and continue that momentum into the Summit of the Future in September 2024. Today marks the second day of Sustainability Week, and the UNGA President is calling for all stakeholders to choose sustainability, highlighting that impactful transformation remains central to the ongoing efforts to advance all three dimensions of sustainable development: social, economic, and environmental, to achieve peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainability for all. While the official program for Sustainability Week does reflect these three pillars, we at UNANIMA International notice there is still minimal focus on the social dimensions of sustainability issues. Ultimately, the program lacks acknowledgement of intersections between environmental sustainability and individual and collective well-being in a way that goes beyond the status quo development paradigm. And while there is an emphasis on building global resilience through improved infrastructure, the discussions seem to lack holistic perspectives or approaches which place people and their well-being at the center of policy and decision-making, rather than economic gain. The goal of this event is to expand how we define and understand sustainability, while also grounding sustainability efforts in the individual and collective experience. When we talk about sustainable approaches to global policymaking, we're not just talking about environmental sustainability. We're also talking about the effectiveness and durability of those approaches. With the deadline for the 2030 agenda rapidly approaching, it is vital to take into consideration the sustainability of the work done within and around the UN to drive progress on the Sustainable Development Goals, including at the individual level. Sustainable and holistic approaches to our work must be trauma-informed to keep the momentum moving forward for continuous improvement and to break cycles of harm and injustice. We need to acknowledge the role trauma may play in an individual and community's life, and how trauma intersects with many health, social, economic, and environmental problems. In our advocacy work, in policymaking, and in our daily lives, we must integrate trauma-informed approaches which prioritize safety, mental and physical health, trustworthiness, collaboration, and empowerment, as only then we can foster meaningful change for a sustainable future. So with that in mind, today's panel discussion serves as a critical opportunity to bridge these gaps and amplify the voices, calling for a more inclusive and holistic approach to sustainable development. As you may have seen in the concept note in front of you, this panel will be broken into two different panel discussions. The first panel will provide a space for advocates and representatives to reflect on their own well-being and mental health, and will discuss strategies for incorporating advocacy priorities, such as holistic approaches to sustainable development, into the workplace. The second panel will be centered on advocacy for holistic approaches to global policymaking while prioritizing well-being. Panelists will reflect on the intersections of physical, mental, social, and environmental well-being, and will discuss best practices for integrating well-being considerations into global processes and policies. So since we have an ambitious program ahead of us, I'd like to kindly remind all of our panelists to keep their remarks to 8 to 10 minutes. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our first set of experts, who again will reflect on the correlations between the improvement of individual well-being and the well-being of other members of society in the natural environment. And first, we will hear from Blair Nelson, who will be joining us on Zoom. Blair Nelson is Executive Director of Water Spirit, a spiritual ecology nonprofit sponsored by the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace. Through programs, education, and advocacy, Water Spirit inspires, informs, and empowers people of all beliefs to deepen the consciousness of the sacredness of water in all Earth systems. In October 2022, Water Spirit launched the online Climate Pastoral Care course, co-authored by Blair and Jessica Morthorpe. Blair also represents the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace at the United Nations, where she is actively engaged in faith-based environmental collaborations. Blair received her Master's of Arts in Religion from Yale Divinity School and her BA with honors in environmental studies from Brown University. She is an experienced meditation coach and retreat leader. Blair, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to share some thoughts today. This is the topic near and dear to my heart, and I'm sorry that I couldn't be in the room with you all this afternoon, but I'm still glad I get to participate from afar. I'm going to take one moment to pull up my screen, and then we'll get things underway. There we go. So I'd like to begin by sharing some remarks on what individual mental health has to do with environmental health and what faith has to do with climate distress. And we're going to be beginning from a place of personal reflection ourselves. So I'd like to invite you to turn your focus inward for a few moments to answer the question or to fill in the blank. When I think about climate change, I feel blank. So one more time. When I think about climate change, I feel blank. There are lots of possible answers to that question, since we are capable of feeling so many types of emotions at any given point in time. There's an example of a word cloud on the left-hand side of my screen that displays some of the answers that just one person gave to that prompt. When I think about climate change, I feel, and you can see a whole range of answers, from optimistic to fearful, to empathetic, to apathetic, to tolerant, to vulnerable, to isolated, and all of this from just one person. And you can also see a tool on the right-hand side of your screen developed by the Climate Mental Health Network. This is the Climate Emotions Wheel. You can read through a few of the related emotions that come up frequently when people think about climate change. So let's just take 10 seconds and pause so that you can think of a few of your own answers to yourself. When I think about climate change, I feel blank. After this panel, feel free to share some of your answers with your neighbors. It's important to get curious about your emotions so that they don't pop up unexpectedly or in ways that you later regret. It's important to create time where you can do this kind of letting your feelings catch up with you, to really check in with yourself when you're in a moment when it's safe to process those feelings that come up. This is important on our path toward regulating our nervous systems and expanding our windows of tolerance, particularly when we're actively engaged in caring professions or in the advocacy fields or in fields where we are often carrying heavy burdens that can lead to huge feelings. Doing this kind of internal emotional processing helps you be a more effective advocate. Now, some examples of climate emotions. So these are emotions that might come up particularly and specifically related to environmental change and to climate change. Some that have been getting increasingly named in the literature are things like climate anxiety, eco-grief, solastalgia, which is like nostalgia, but it's for the way that a place used to be, and pre-traumatic stress disorder. But the term that's getting the most press out of all of these is eco-anxiety. Eco-anxiety is defined by the American Psychological Association as the chronic fear of environmental doom. Lots of times when we think about mood disorders like anxiety, we think that they are personal problems to be fixed. However, eco-anxiety is not quite the same as regular anxiety. Rather, as scholar Britt Ray writes, eco-anxiety is a moral emotion. It is a coherent and empathetic response to a society in decline. And when I started my position at Water Spirit in 2019, I added programming on the topic of climate emotions like these. So often I have heard people rush to two easy conclusions that the remedy for climate despair or for eco-anxiety or ecological grief is action. If you want to feel better, take action, plain and simple. As if everyone who is experiencing climate distress were simply too lazy to do anything or were paralyzed by fear. But I've been an environmental activist my whole career, and I still have these feelings. And I'm tired of seeing passionate people working in ways that can lead to burnout and compassion fatigue. So I asked myself, how can we avoid this? How can we make our collective actions regenerative? Tackling environmental change, the burden can feel very heavy to bear. And I believe that processing our feelings in safe spaces, which faith communities are poised to do and to be, is one way that we can metabolize and move through these feelings into long-term action that is sustainable and meaningful. Faith communities are uniquely poised to help with climate distress, but we need to be certain that we are prepared to address these climate emotions specifically. Training in climate pastoral care, for example, is vital because pastoral care for those experiencing climate mental health issues is a specialized field and context. And standard pastoral care training and ministry courses are unlikely to have specifically addressed how climate distress differs from other forms of mental ill health. So if you're thinking to yourself that climate anxiety or climate grief or its impacts have never come up in your faith communities before, there's a chance you might not be asking the right questions, because more and more we're seeing that these issues are directly impacting people. And if we don't talk about it, the isolation only makes things worse. If climate change were easy to fix with purely technological solutions, churches would have little role in saving the world, and churches and other faith groups. But long-term solutions need so much more than just technology. They need changes in thinking, culture, society, politics, governance. These are areas that our traditions equip us to help with. And I really love sharing this quote from top environmentalist Gus Speth when I think about what role that faith communities have in mitigating climate change. He shared, "I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with those, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. Faiths have a role to play. Faiths need a seat at the table. So we have to find and use the tools that will keep us in this work for the long haul so that we can bring about this transformation without burning ourselves out in the process." Providing pastoral care to those who are grieving can be familiar territory for those in faith communities. This knowledge, experience, and the rituals that we use to help people process their grief can be huge assets to bring to the table when we're helping people process their ecological and climate grief as well. By acknowledging and living with our climate grief, we can come to recognize that the root of this pain is our love for the world, for its creatures, and for all of creation. Therefore, it is important not to suppress these emotions. As Dr. Jennifer Atkinson shared, when we suppress our grief for the world, we're also suppressing our compassion for it. And if we see grief as a reflection of our love, it can help us acknowledge and honor our pain instead of suppressing it. Faith communities are used to helping people find complicated hope in situations of adversity. Encouraging those in your community to share what the climate crisis makes them feel and to check in on their mental well-being, referring them on to professional help as needed, is a critical step in sustaining environmental action for the long haul and fostering real complicated hope that feeds our sense of agency instead of draining us. Water Spirit, under my tenure, has taken on a lot of programming in the field of climate distress and climate emotions. I do want to share a few upcoming opportunities for you to join us, to find yourselves in safe spaces to process some of these feelings that might come up. One resource that we have online, as Leanna mentioned in my introduction, is the Climate Pastoral Care course. This is an online self-paced course directed at Christian communities to help Christian caregivers feel better resourced to addressing the mental health impacts of climate change in themselves and in their communities. In the fall, we will also be offering the next round of our 10-step eco-anxiety support group. We are an affiliate organization of a group called the Good Grief Network. They developed this 10-step system that is loosely based on the Alcoholics Anonymous model that takes us from acknowledging the severity of the predicament that we find ourselves in through doing much of the inner work that we need in order to then discover what our effective and meaningful action is in the world and to step back into this work better resourced. And on May 8th, we are delighted to be joining the BTS Center for their next installment of their Lament with Earth series. This is a beautiful online offering of prayer and music, lament, and sharing together. May 8th session will be on the topic of water, and the Water Spirit team will be leading the talk back afterward. If you'd like to know more about any of these offerings, they're on Water Spirit's website, www.waterspirit.org. There you can also find out more details about this 10-step eco-anxiety support group that we offer. And throughout the site, you can find some more of our favorite resources and recommendations, including the Climate Aware Therapists Directory that's put together by the Climate Psychiatry Alliance and the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America. And I'd love to continue the conversation at any point. Unfortunately, I'm unable to stay to the end of today's event, but please reach out at any time at water@waterspirit.org. And know that if climate change is making you feel and shoulder very heavy feelings, you are not alone in these, and there are resources that are ready and able to help you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Blair, for providing those insights on eco-anxiety and for so clearly connecting sustainability and holistic well-being through the more specific examples of mental health and environmental action. I first heard the phrase eco-anxiety from Blair, and it really resonated with me and was so validating of the existential dread that I do feel when I think of climate change. And I think we so often think of climate change as this massive global issue, but then the responsibility to do something about it does fall on individual shoulders. And we don't pay enough attention to thinking about how to help people process and acknowledge their climate grief in order to channel those emotions into better channels. So thank you again, Blair, and for joining despite your tight schedule. And if you'd like to connect more with Blair and didn't catch her contact information, we'll be sure to share it after the event. So next up, we'll move on to Savita Gear. Savita is a UN representative of the Brahma Kumaris in New York for the past 8 years. Her work is based on the understanding that real change begins with a shift in awareness, facilitated by a spiritual-based approach called Raja Yoga. Savita co-organizes and participates in many projects related to UN Sustainable Development Goals using such peace-building methods. She is also the vice chair of the Committee on Spirituality, Values, and Global Concerns. Savita is a practicing student and teacher of the art of Raj Yoga for over 45 years and has conducted courses, facilitated workshops and retreats in the Caribbean, UK, India, Middle East, and many states across the USA. She's been living in the US for the last 25 years, and before that, she served in Guyana in the Caribbean. Savita has a background in physics and mathematics. Savita, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Very good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, friends, colleagues. Thank you, UNANIMA International, for organizing this event and for the invitation to share this afternoon. It is my pleasure to be sharing in this room with so many distinguished guests and panelists. As we all aware that the challenges and the living conditions of our world have worsened over the years, bringing more urgency to achieving the UN Agenda 2030. Sometimes I wonder whether we are fighting a losing battle. The confidence and the conviction we used to have about the future has given way to uncertainty and worry. Our old methods, resolutions, treaties, and armed interventions have not improved the state of the world. And so if we apply the same instruments that we've used in the past, these, as we would agree, would not be adequate. However, we cannot lose hope. Even though the pressure is on, we as human beings can accomplish anything, especially when we put our hearts and souls into it. We are all committed to serve, as it is our passion to build a world of peace and harmony among all life. However, as Blair said a little earlier, when we work so hard, we could end up with compassion fatigue. And so in order to avoid or prevent such burnout, a sustainable self-care plan or practice is essential. As Wayne Dyer said, we cannot give away what we do not have. There is a deep connection between our outer world and our inner world. They are parts of the same wheel of life. For the outer state of the world to be improved, the inner state of the world must first be improved. If peace is to be attained, we must first start with inner peace. If world stability is needed, we must start by cultivating inner stability. If corruption is to be eliminated, we must eradicate corruption from our minds and souls, thereby returning to our original nature of peace and nonviolence. We know that every expression of human beings is rooted in the subtle level of our awareness, which in turn affects our attitude, vision, and then our words and actions. The quality of each word and action can be traced back to the inner state of awareness one had when that action was taken. Many understand this to be the philosophy of karma, which means action, of the individual and collective. It follows then that the world we have today is a world created by the collective thoughts and words and actions of 8+ billion human beings. Amazing. This, of course, didn't happen overnight. It took generations for us to get to this point. And this is why sometimes it is difficult to see the connection between our inner state and the impact it has on our outer state. And so we tend to kind of overlook it, or we tend to sometimes deny that it is happening, or we pretend, right? It is not so. So how do we ensure our inner world is healthy? This past weekend, I attended the Climate Reality project training that took place in New York City. And one of the highlights that came up very strongly was making sure that there is self-care. Because as we know, if we're not taking care of ourselves, how can we take care of everything else around us? And we can do this in so many ways. We can do this by walking in nature, practicing deep breathing, journaling, art, meditation, because anything that connects our inner self and nature actually shifts the conscience. And when our conscience is shifted, then our vision will change. So our practice really is to always tap into, go back inwards, go back in there, check in. How am I doing? What am I doing? When we take the time to do that, amazingly enough, and naturally, we connect with the core of our being, which is positive. We don't really connect with the anger, the fear, or the anxiety. That's the upper layers. When we really connect with the core, we actually touch base with the goodness inside of us, which is the peace and the non-violence, etc. When we tap into that, our inner inner conscience that shifts. And because there's that shift from that deeper level, then obviously the choices that we make would be different. The way we look at each other would definitely be different. Our connections, when we say connections, of course, we're referring to connections on all levels, right? Whether it's connection with myself, connection with each other, connection with Mother Nature, and if I may bring this in connection with higher power, the supreme energy, the divine. This type of connection from inward out is called like the spiritual trajectory. And this, from my experience and my practice, I find has brought about tremendous improvement in the way I maintain my mental health, my inner health. And so the challenge in this practice, this spiritual trajectory practice is when we are in a meeting. See, in gathering like this, it's easy because we're on the same page here, I think. But if we're in a meeting and there are differences of opinion, or some things are very critical, we are coming from a spiritual perspective, but we might not be on the same page. How do we still bring, right? And so this practice beforehand comes in very useful at that time. It is something that we call traffic control. The traffic control of our thoughts, or pause for peace. And it just allows us to take that pause. We practice this on a regular basis so that when we are in situations of chaos, I not even get easy. It might be just got to fall on. That wasn't a very pleasant message coming from the other side. How do we hold our inner and so I would like to invite you all for a minute. Let us pause, let us practice this traffic control, and we're going to pretend that we are doing something that we normally do every day, maybe not this beautiful setting. and our phone beeps reminding us, it's time for a pause, it's time for time out. And so let's collect our thoughts, and the phone beeps. And what I do is put my pen and pencil down, take a deep breath in. I invite you to join me. Take a deep breath in, and then release. Take another deep breath in. And as we breathe in peace, love. We're breathing in oxygen. And we're breathing out the carbon dioxide out into the world. Mother Nature is collecting it all, providing us back with oxygen. I calm myself down. And in this state of calm, I turn inward. I connect with the light within. I connect with my peace, with the non-violence, the love, the harmony. And I hold myself there. See the shift that takes place.
डिसेबिलिटीको लागि अर्कै प्रणाली होला लागि अर्को प्रणाली तपाईले आफ्नो पोलिसी चाहिँ इम्प्याक्ट गर्नको लागि तपाईले सक्दो सहयोग गर्नु पर्यो प्लस उनीहरूको कुराहरू सुन्नु पर्यो ताकि उनीहरूलाई चाहिँ त्यो पोलिसीले कतिको असर गरेको
I'll gently bring my thoughts back. And when we practice this, when things are all right on a regular basis, every hour, every 2 hours, whatever, we build up inner stability and stamina, inner muscles, so so that when we are in other kinds of environment, we can fall back on this practice that can help us to realign at that set time and hold ourselves. Because again, it's our connection that we have with each other. And by doing this, we're not only holding ourselves stable, but regenerating the energy out to each other and to the world. And in closing, I would just like to remind us of the beautiful room in that UN headquarters that many of us are familiar with, the meditation room that Hammarskjöld has declared it needs to be here. That, as many of you probably know, is the second Secretary General. And I quote a little part of what he said. He said, "We all have within us a center of stillness surrounded by silence. This house, the UN, dedicated to work and debate in the service of peace, should have one room dedicated to silence in the outward sense and stillness in the inner sense. It has been the aim to create in this small room a place where doors may be open to infinite lands of thought and prayer." So thank you all very much, and I hope this practice is meaningful to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabita, for sharing, and apologies to some people online who are having a little trouble hearing, but hopefully the microphone will help with that now. And I think when we're thinking about connecting the individual to the collective, to the environment, you just connected all of those pieces so perfectly, especially through that meditative breathing exercise. I've said so often I'm going to start meditating, and I think so often that sustainable self-care plan just falls to the bottom of our very long to-do list. And so I'm definitely leaving here today inspired and hoping to incorporate more of those practices into our work. And it's like you said, if we apply the same instruments we've used in the past, we know that they're not adequate and we need to be looking beyond that. So thank you again for sharing and for being here. And next up, we'll hear from Katie Garrison. Katie currently serves as the Associate Coordinator for the Justice Coalition of Religious. She holds a degree in Psychology and International Peace Studies from the University of Notre Dame and a Master's in the Philosophy of International Peace Studies from Trinity College, Dublin. Her career as an advocacy practitioner spans nearly 10 years in the United Nations community. She began working as an intern for the Dominican Leadership Conference and continued on to a position as an advocacy officer specializing in international migration policy, work which included visits with grassroots partners and peoples on the move throughout Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and the Middle East. She is passionate about facilitating and integrating the voices of local level actors into policy discussions of the United Nations. Katie, you have the floor.
So I want to begin the conversation today with full transparency. Although I do possess a degree in psychology, I am by no means a clinical psychologist or a licensed clinical social worker. So the perspective that I want to share with you today on the topic of well-being and mental health in the context of policy and advocacy work includes the expertise of lived experience. A lived experience with which I imagine a number of people in this room and those of you joining us online will be able to identify with. I'm both passionate and curious about the interlinkages between mental health and sustainability, particularly in relation to the question of how we prioritize sustaining ourselves in our work. Are we taking care of our own well-being and mental health in a way that enables us to sustainably show up and be fully present in the work that we do? In the words of Thomas Merton, a Catholic theologian and social activist, there is a pervasive form of contemporary violence to which the idealist most easily succumbs: activism and overwork. The rush and pressure of modern life are a form, perhaps the most common form, of its innate violence. To allow oneself to be carried away by a multitude of conflicting concerns, to surrender to too many demands, to commit oneself to too many projects, to want to help everyone and everything is to succumb to violence. The frenzy of our activism neutralizes our work for peace. It destroys our own inner capacity for peace. It destroys the fruitfulness of our own work because it kills the root of inner wisdom. How many of you can identify with this description? How many of us feel the pull of a multitude of demands, commit ourselves to too many projects, neglect to take care of ourselves to the detriment of our work? How can we do a better job of tending to our inner peace? Many of us have probably heard about burnout, and we've heard about it again here today, a word that has become part of the everyday working lexicon as society strives to normalize conversations about mental health. And burnout certainly constitutes a serious condition, but since many of us are already familiar with its manifestations, I'd like to focus some of my remarks today on an area that is lesser known and perhaps more insidious, an issue which can lead to overworking, burnout, cynicism, and hopelessness. The topic I would like to discuss is secondary trauma, also referred to as secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma. Secondary trauma has long been talked about in relation to helping professions like social workers and first responders in emergencies, but it's a relatively new topic in the realm of policy and advocacy work, as Blair mentioned earlier. If you're working in or around government, public policy, or advocacy, there's a strong chance that you're interacting with individuals who have suffered or who are traumatized, possibly transferring that trauma onto you. Secondary trauma is that stress that you experience from one time or from repeated exposure to helping or wanting to help individuals who have directly experienced trauma and share their trauma with you in some way. It is the emotional distress that we experience when we observe or listen to narratives of people who have experienced direct trauma. In the community of advocacy practitioners, we talk a lot about narratives and their significance in our work. But how often do we pause to consider how the exposure to these narratives impacts us and our own mental health? Reflect on your work for a moment. How many times a day are you ingesting narratives by reading, listening to, or watching the news? Are you interviewing people in conflict zones? Are you meeting with individuals who have been forced to migrate? Are you tracking human rights violations and coding them for research? Are you speaking with local level voices on Zoom calls about emerging justice concerns around the world? Some of these narratives may propel you to action, and others may cause stress or debilitate you in ways that you did not anticipate and you may not even realize. Although you are not directly experiencing the traumas that are being detailed in these narratives, you experience it vicariously. This is secondary trauma. I want to emphasize that experiencing secondary trauma is normal. It's normal psychological and physical responses to what we hear, learn, and experiences from those that we engage with and serve in our work. So what do the symptoms or warning signs of secondary trauma look like? Think of these like a warning light on your vehicle. When the low fuel indicator illuminates on your dashboard, you notice it, you pay attention, and you address it. You know your car cannot run without petrol, or in some cases, electric power in the context of today's conversation. So you stop to refuel. Similarly, the following symptoms are potential warning signs that we need to stop and tend to our mental health. Are you becoming quick to anger about something that would not normally upset you? Are you disengaging from events that you would normally enjoy attending? Are you struggling to concentrate at work or having trouble sleeping at night? Do you exhibit an increasingly cynical attitude and a hopeless worldview? Another common symptom is maximizing the work that you're doing. Do you feel that you can never do enough to adequately address an issue, so you work excessive hours, including nights and weekends? Has your identity become inextricably intertwined with your work? Are you experiencing new and extended physical pain or medical issues? Do you minimize your own mental health needs because it's easy to compare yourself to those you represent in your advocacy and assure yourself that you have privilege, that you have not suffered as much as others, and therefore you should be able to suck it up and move on? Are you trying to numb your feelings by spending more time on social media, doom scrolling, binge watching shows on Netflix, or engaging in other addictive behaviors? These are all symptoms and warning signs that you may be experiencing a response to the secondary trauma you've been exposed to. Neglecting these indicators of our mental health can result in adverse results for our work. For example, if we're approaching meetings with policymakers from a point of cynicism rather than hopefulness, it's not likely to move them or to help our cause. Unaddressed secondary trauma not only diminishes our effectiveness in our work, but it also can affect our job satisfaction and lead to burnout, compassion fatigue, and even long-term physical and psychological distress. So what can we do if we recognize these signs and symptoms emerging within ourselves? We can't prevent ourselves from feeling the emotions or stress that result from vicarious trauma, but we do possess the power to mitigate its potentially harmful effects. To mitigate the effects of secondary trauma, we can work on developing resiliency and building healthy coping mechanisms. And I think we've already heard a few today. A framework that I find helpful in terms of fostering resiliency is referred to as the ABC framework, which emphasizes awareness, balance, and connection. So let's talk about awareness. We need to be aware of our triggers. Are you noticing changes in your work habits or functioning? Do you feel overwhelmed? Are you recognizing any of the previously discussed indicators? Is there a pattern of behavior you're noticing when you're not at your best? And if you notice these patterns, be curious about why you're engaging in those behaviors. Ask yourself if they're helpful or if you should be doing something different. And at this stage of awareness, it may also be helpful to talk to your supervisor if they do provide a safe space, or even a mental health professional. Second in ABC is balance. I know we've all heard this before, but it's definitely worth repeating. We must seek balance between our work and our personal lives. And if you cannot differentiate between these two, that's a warning sign. Perfect balance seems and probably is an impossible ideal, but we can take steps towards achieving a more sustainable balance between work and our personal life. For example, we can establish healthy boundaries, like not checking email after hours, or committing to actually taking our full allotment of annual leave or paid vacation. If you're feeling overworked, you can talk to a supervisor for support in priority management and triaging your workload. And as trite as this phrase has become, we must also prioritize self-care, such as exercise, mindfulness, and pursuit of hobbies. And I want to make a very strong note here that self-care is not simply something a social media post or a podcast or society purports as self-care. Effective self-care means taking note of activities and practices that help you personally re-energize and maintain your resilience. And this is going to look different for everyone. For example, we hear a lot about, and we've heard about today, some meditation and mindfulness practices that can be really helpful. For me personally, traditional meditation is not very beneficial, but I love to go running. When I go running, my brain waves slow down. My whole body is overcome with a sense of calm. It's a mindfulness and a meditation in its own right. And at the same time, it helps me physically move the stress out of my body. So when we talk about self-care and its importance, please recognize how particular that is to each person. And we each need to check in and make sure the activities that we are doing are energizing us when we need it. And third, I want to talk about connection. It's imperative for us to foster supportive relationships within and outside of work. You need to cultivate a network of colleagues, mentors, friends, and family members who you can turn to for guidance and emotional support. Trusted individuals that create safe spaces with whom you can share your experience and feelings. Engaging in these meaningful conversations in this network can provide validation, perspective, and a much needed sense of belonging. All of these are critical in combating the effects of secondary trauma. And finally, I would encourage everyone not to hesitate to seek professional help if needed. Seeking help is a sign of strength, not a weakness. And prioritizing your mental health and well-being is essential for both you individually and for the people you're serving in your policy and advocacy work. So I'll wrap up on this note. Taking care of ourselves is not a luxury. Especially in this line of work, it is essential. Prioritizing our well-being and actively engaging with strategies to manage secondary trauma means that we are safeguarding ourselves and enhancing our capacity to make a meaningful difference in the lives of others. In this sense, prioritizing our mental health is a key element in achieving sustainability in our work.
Thank you so much, Katie, for sharing those reflections. And on secondary trauma, which is another term I wasn't familiar with before speaking with you. And I really appreciate you concretely connecting this discussion to the workplace. In our work, we do talk so much about impactful storytelling without reflecting on the impact of those stories on ourselves as advocates and practitioners and researchers. And that really struck a chord with me. And we advocate for these trauma-informed approaches, but don't apply those approaches to ourselves. And I mean, as we've heard throughout today already, individual and global resilience are intrinsically intertwined. So if we're not building resilience in the workplace, how are we supposed to build resilience on the collective and global levels? And I'll definitely keep in mind the ABCs that you were mentioning. You know, for our work to be sustainable and to drive progress on sustainability initiatives, we do need that awareness and balance and connection in ourselves and in the workplace. So thank you so much for sharing. Okay, let's do one more round of applause for all of our panelists on that first portion. You all did a wonderful job of really creating that reflective space that we wanted to create today during that portion of the panel. So we're greatly appreciative. And we'll now move on to the second portion of today's panel, which will be on holistic well-being and sustainability as an integrative policy approach. Through this discussion, we seek to share best practices and advocate for policy orientation that places people and their well-being at the center of decision-making, enabling people to reach their full potential, contribute to sustainability efforts, and enjoy their fundamental rights. First up on this portion of the panel, we have Sri Husnaini Sofyan. Sri has over 25 years of experience working on good governance, ICT and e-governance, regional global coordination of women's networks in cities, and manages and programs urban management and gender equality projects funded by United Nations agencies and governments. Sri is a member of UN Habitat's advisory group on gender issues and is the co-chair of UN Habitat's World Urban Campaign. Sri is a senior program advisor and strategist at Huairou Commission, was the first CEO of the Penang Women's Development Corporation Malaysia, and was the program manager at UNIFEM, now known as UN Women, in Aceh, Indonesia. She first gained international exposure and expertise working with UNDP's Asia Pacific Regional Project on urban management and urban governance from 1993 to 2004, and the global program Private-Public Partnership on Urban Environment in 2004 and 2005. Sri is zooming in from Malaysia, where she's based and currently located. So Sri, thank you so much for being here and participating in this discussion, despite how late it is for you. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to join this August panel. I think, you know, I appreciate new insight of the mental healthcare or mental well-being that was being shared by our first panel. I think what I'm going to share is looking at, you know, from the grassroots perspective, because Huairou Commission work with grassroots women, and we look at, when we talk about sustainability, we look at the 5 pillars of sustainable development: people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. At the same time, you know, being mindful of the 4 pillars of sustainability, that is environment, social, economic, and culture. So with this onset, I would like to share with you what we call, by working with grassroots women and making sure that they balance both, you know, their activism as well as their advocacy to transform their life, the life of the people that they work with, their family and their community through advocacy work. So let me share with you what we call the Huayru Commission Resilient and Sustainability Diamond. I'll share the screen right now. I hope you can see the screen. So on the screen, you will see, when we work on advocacy, integrating advocacy and making sure that there's a sustainability and resilience of the people that work in promoting sustainable development. We start with, strengthening the grassroots women organizing and leadership. And that means, building their awareness, their leadership capacity, and increasing their awareness and access to information, access to capacity building, and making sure that they have those space. And this is a continuous process, because building awareness, leadership training, increasing their capacity, is a continuous process through mobilizing, and a collective mobilizing. It's not individual, but the individual person or leadership of each person, and together they build their strength. And this is very important for women leaders, to have the group and the constituency that they can work with and also fall back to for support. So that relates to also, which I will share later, what we call the leadership development process. From the mobilizing and strengthening this grassroots women's organizing and leadership capacity, we go into what we say, what we look at is promote development and awareness of locally led initiative, where this grassroots women group will start analyzing, mapping the challenges and opportunity in their community, come up with good practices, with initial piloting of activities, and then they go into dialogue with stakeholder. Through this dialogue with stakeholder, they start also building constituencies and network and alliances with other groups, with those with similar ideas and vision, and also giving them the opportunity for peer learning and exchanges. And there, they will also create partnership with relevant stakeholders to start, going into influencing and changing public policy processes. This is where we involve community and women's leadership in decision-making forum, making sure that their work, their role and leadership are recognized, and that the community-led implementation of program and activities are supported, resourced, recognized, and upscale. So with all these activities, and I relate back to also the last presentation about, the ABC of awareness, balancing, and also a connection. We also have what we call, let me bring this stop here and then go into the next sharing of our tools. Can you see it now? The leadership, I'm trying to share. Yeah. So to sustain leadership of grassroots women, to make sure that they have support and the balance that we talk about, related to the awareness, balance, and connection. We work with this tool where we support grassroots women leadership capacity building with what we call the leadership support process. Here, we start with all the grassroots women agreeing and defining on what they want to do and why, and the values that they believe in, what motivates them into taking action, the action that through the diamond that I shared earlier, the resilient and sustainability diamond, yeah? A vision that, inspire them to work and ensure that, we have a sustainable development in their community, for their community, and for the future generation. And with that vision, this grassroots leader will come up with the roadmap that guides their action. One of the important things that when they work together is to have basic agreements. And these basic agreements include, respecting diversity, working together, listening to each other, and appreciating the work that they work, appreciate each of their contribution, each person's contribution, and making sure that everyone's voices are heard and are respected upon. The third point in this for this leadership development process is that each of the leaders will respect and support each other and recognize each other as leaders. I think when you work with together, everyone is a leader at different level. So leadership is seeing to it as that things around you go as well as possible, and where you use resources, you know how to use resources, you know how to go to the person that when you need help. So here the title is not very important, but acting as leaders, and working in a team is very important, so that leaders are not stuck, burnt out, and mistake is seen as a learning process rather than blaming each other, and they can work together and learn from each other and get support and give feedback and get feedback as well. So that's where grassroots women development and leadership continues to grow. They have support, and we avoid the mental burden from their activism. Yeah. We also this leadership tool also advocate and put forward principle honoring diversity, because each one of us comes from a different background with different skill, ideas, experience, and culture, and that each of the leaders should respect each other, have an open mindset, and be open-minded. And this is very important to ensure that grassroots women are empowered as leaders and recognized as leaders. And most importantly, also, I mentioned earlier, we use appreciation and participatory process whenever they work together, whenever they meet, And this is very important to ensure that they sustain their work, they are able to be together, and the work that they do at the community level that we advocate every day and to ensure that we have a better environment, we have better social economic standing and progress for their community, for their people, for the family continues and not stopped. And this leadership process is continuously used in all their activities. I hope this, is useful in this discussion and this session when we talk about the balance of mental health and also our continuous work advocating and ensuring that we have sustainable development and that, we never stop, and that, when we meet with crisis and all that, we are able to overcome that and use also some of the methodologies, some of the practices that the previous speakers talk about. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Spree, and again for joining us at so late your time. I think your reflections from the grassroots perspective are certainly a valuable contribution to this discussion, and your insights and best practices on building climate resilience through community-driven development. I think the diamond approach and the leadership support process you outlined are certainly holistic approaches which center individual, collective, and planetary well-being. And, as we know, trauma-informed approaches are as much about building empowerment, recognition, and resilience as they are about acknowledging experiences of trauma. So the best practices developed by the Hawaii Royal Commission are certainly holistic in that sense as well. And then to connect it back to our past discussion, creating sustainable workplaces and effective practices does require empowering those with lived experiences, as I know almost all of us in this room are very passionate about advocating for. Now, next up, we'll move on to Dr. Alan Shapiro. Alan Shapiro, MD, is the co-founder and chief strategy officer of Terra Firma National. He is also the co-founder and medical director of Terra Firma's flagship program in the South Bronx. Dr. Shapiro is an assistant professor of pediatrics at Albert Einstein College of Medicine and senior medical director of the Bronx Health Collective, a federally qualified health center of Montefiore Medical Center. Additionally, he served on the American Academy of Pediatrics inaugural executive committee of the Council on Immigrant Child and Family Health. Dr. Shapiro has also been an advocate for immigrant children and families throughout his career, whether directly in his pediatric practice or through work with the American Academy of Pediatrics and human rights organizations. Most recently, he was the co-author of a New England Journal of Medicine article, When Undoing is Not Enough, Repairing Harm Inflicted on Immigrant Children. So with that, Dr. Shapiro, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Leanna, and thanks to UNANIMA for this invitation. It's an incredible panel, and so I'm feeling a little intimidated right now. I learned so much from Lara, Sabit, and Katie. So and Sri's last presentation on the paradigm for their approach and for improving and preventing burnout is really was a very good learning lesson. I think my presentation is perhaps more about the challenges that we all face through the work, and maybe less around the solution to sustainability, but maybe mine's an example of what we all need to help with. So I think also that, in terms of the sphere of improving health as one of the key areas, I think partnership comes to mind the most in sort of the approach that we need to deal with this very, very complex problem that I'm going to talk about. So, As a pediatrician and human rights advocate, the UN 17 Sustainability Development Goals, which I was familiar with but reread last night, really deeply resonated with me. And as a community pediatrician working in the South Bronx in the poorest congressional district in the United States, and as a human rights advocate focused on the needs of migrant children and families, the 17 Sustainability Development Goals feel absolutely daunting. So I'm not really sure what to do with all of that. But I would say as a pediatrician, we are by nature optimists. And so, and because the lives of children are so important to our future, I'll share a little bit with you about what we're working on, what my colleagues and I are working on here in New York City, and then hopefully nationally in addressing the issue that is really working with the complex healthcare, mental health, and social needs of unaccompanied migrant children and migrant families that are seeking humanitarian protection in the United States. The populations we serve in some ways when we're at the community level are at the endpoint of their long and arduous migration trajectory. But for many, it's also the starting point of the rest of their lives, which, again, is very daunting and a lot of pressure for us to think about and to make sure we're doing things correctly. Just in general, there's over 40 million children, at least over 40 million children that have been forcibly displaced from their homes globally, according to the UNHCR's 2022 statistics. Really, these are children that face unfathomable odds. Many are unaccompanied children, arguably the most vulnerable, and others are in family units. And those families have their own vulnerabilities, as I hear about all the time in my work with the children and families that are coming up through Central America and Mexico. Various combinations of abject poverty, war, failed states, climate change and climate disasters, community violence, gender-based violence, and domestic violence, including intimate partner and child abuse, as well as other forms of persecution, are the most common factors forcing children and families to migrate from their homes. The migration pathway is fraught with peril, physical and psychological trauma at every step of the pathway before, during, and after migration. In the program in which I work, we have heard firsthand how their lives have been placed in peril and the enormous resilience they possess to have made it so far to actually get to my office in the South Bronx. It's really quite extraordinary. Sometimes I have families from Brooklyn and they say, well, we don't know how to get to your clinic in the Bronx. I'm like, but you made it all the way from Venezuela to here. How could that be a problem? So I remind them of that. But really the upheaval in young people's lives cannot be overstated. Forced migration disrupts their sense of self-identity, their health, their well-being, their growth, their development, and education. And we know that the cumulative effects of these experiences can have lifelong consequences and has been demonstrated to increase the risk of chronic health and mental health conditions, really for the rest of their life. And this is a lot under this toxic stress model where chronic exposure to trauma, especially without mitigated caregivers that can buffer that trauma, is very detrimental to their short-term and long-term health. So it is for this reason that the reception of migrant children and families into this country or into any country where folks are dealing with migrants must really meet the best interest of the child. And those best interest rules have been developed by the UN, by this Convention on the Rights of the Child, by the Declaration of Human Rights, and we really need to abide by those. In other words, the reception must be tailored to the unique needs of children, be child-focused, be trauma-informed, preserve family unity, provide safe, clean housing and high-quality medical, mental health, and social supports. And if you think about all of those tenets, all those principles, in even the way that we deal with migrant children and families in this country, I mean, it's quite horrifying, and the work that's cut out for us. both to be vigilant that this doesn't continue to happen, but also to respond when it does, can be overwhelming, which is why all of the things that everybody has talked about today is so important for us to remember. Because if we're not strong, Sabita, if we don't have inner strength, we can't have outer strength. So that really resonated with me. Humane reception also should apply to conditions on either side of whatever border children and families are crossing from and into, should never criminalize them, and should allow for soft landing once released from custody, where they enter communities pending any immigration proceedings. So this is where Terra Firma, my organization, steps in. It's very much at the community level, at the micro level. And I'll pivot a little bit now into talking a little bit about the work that I've been very deeply engaged in the last 11 years here in New York City. So in 2013, we started to see an increase in unaccompanied migrant children entering the US, and likewise in New York, one of the top sites to receive children. I co-founded Terra Firma with Brett Stark, an immigration attorney. This is the partnership part. And Dr. Cristina Muñiz de la Peña, a psychologist I was working with, to address the complex needs of unaccompanied children and families seeking asylum in this country. Terra Firma is a multidisciplinary, multi-sector model of service delivery that integrates nonprofit legal services inside a community health center so that medical providers, mental health providers, professionals work side by side, immigration attorneys, to facilitate access to all services, so all the services in one place at one time, to improve health and legal outcomes. And those two are very intricately related, we could talk about in question and answer time, but also foster resilience and acculturation. Key principles of our model include using a medical home approach versus sort of the forensic clinic that a lot of asylum clinics work with, which we think the medical home model is more important for children, and we follow the American Academy of Pediatric guidelines for a medical home model. And this really addresses the evolving medical and mental health needs of developing children. So children arrive, they might arrive at 11 or 12, but really, by the time they reach asylum or receive their protection, they are already 15 or 16, so going through whole new developmental periods of their life, and that's very important then to have that medical home to help guide them through that. We are a trauma-informed organization, meaning that we try to adhere to trauma-informed principles as best as possible. We're not always perfect, but really to minimize the re-traumatization that children already have had enough of, and really for us to be prepared for the enormous psychological needs that in most cases are normative and protective for children as a response to the trauma that they've already gone through. And I've learned that principle through our mental health team, which has taught me so much. We talk about one of our key principles is the importance of the medical, mental health, legal nexus. So working together in partnership with legal, medical, and mental health experts that can provide a tighter safety net for children and families, but also ensure better outcomes in immigration proceedings. So for instance, healthcare professionals can uncover and document histories of trauma, provide expert witness, both in written affidavits and oral testimony. That can improve outcomes of cases, prepare children for court. Very much like child protective services, like if you work with children who have been abused, we try to mitigate them having to retell their stories over and over again, and actually ultimately prevent them from even having to go to court in the first place. So that's part of our model. Youth enrichment is incredibly important for us, and it incorporates activities that normalize their lives, such as, first of all, English classes, so they can start really acculturating here, but also soccer, the most important thing we could give them, the arts, field trips, college readiness. And this helps build social networks, fosters resilience, and facilitates acculturation. Lastly, advocacy is a really important part of our model. We're privileged enough to hear the experiences that children and families have been exposed to and they have gone through. And they have to tell us a lot of this stuff, both as a way of healing, but also to help them with their immigration cases. And so that's profound for us. So we, really feel like it's our duty to also be able to advocate for them based on what we hear ourselves. And which has gotten me to the border, got me really to work with the Academy of Pediatrics to make more global changes nationally to improve the lives of children and families, especially in immigration detention at the border. But really, I think our goal is to use that profound perspective on their experiences and how to improve conditions to make the migration experience more humane and dignified, including improving conditions to avoid migration at all costs in the very first place, improving safety of pathways of migration to minimize harm, to provide child and family-centered approach to the reception of children that upholds the principles of the best interest of the child, as I previously mentioned, and to employ holistic approaches to the care in areas where migrants resettle to ensure that they too can land on terra firma, solid ground, and be given a fair chance to reach their full potential. To date, terra firma has served over 1,300 individuals, unaccompanied children and families. We're now currently working with New York City Department of Health and Homeless Services to provide care to the migrant families that have been bused to the border. Another really form of treating migrants inhumanely. Having them arrive, throwing them on a bus and ending up in a new city that has had no ability to prepare for the arrival. In New York City's case, 180,000 plus migrants in less than 2 years. In 2021, to really try to reach further, we launched Terra Firma National, and that was really to replicate the model of service delivery in cities around the country. This year, we are going to replicate for the first time our program in Long Island and in Baltimore, Maryland, two areas that have very large populations of unaccompanied minors and migrant families. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to share our work with you in dialogue about how we can sustain this work in light of the ever-growing numbers of displaced people, of refugees and migrant communities around the world. I mean, one thought that came to me when I was listening to this is, when we think about sustainability, it's like, I have to fight so hard to get the money I need to do this work. Like, that should not be part of the equation. Like, in terms of my own sustainability and self-wellness, it's one thing doing the work, which gives me incredible reward. It's so rewarding. But, I'm also spending all my time writing grants and fighting for these, for things just so we can do this work. And that, is, I think, part of the sustainability equation that really hasn't been mentioned. So I will leave it at that. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shapiro, for sharing those remarks and sharing about your work and for highlighting the importance of the well-being of the child too. Like you said, the well-being of children is vital to the well-being of the future. And so building that resilience for children and youth, especially for those who are particularly vulnerable due to their displacement, it's really incredibly important when we're talking about how to build a sustainable future. And connecting it back to the first portion and some of the discussions we were having about sustainability, we know it's children who face the most consequences of climate change. And again, when we think about the mental health of ourselves and the eco-anxiety we feel, we should also consider the eco-anxiety and those feelings that children are feeling as well. I was also thinking about how the work that Terra Firma does really embodies the holistic approach we've been talking about and how to address the actual needs of today's most vulnerable populations. The trauma-informed approach you discussed, not only through the healthcare and the legal services, but also through the community building activities and the support you provide them. It's a really striking example of how to provide that support that is informed and specific and dignified. So thank you so much for being here and for sharing that model. And last, but certainly not least, we have Winifred Doherty. Winifred is a member of the Congregation of Our Lady of Charity of the Good Shepherd, an NGO in special consultative status with the United Nations. Winifred is from Ireland and the main NGO representative for the Sisters and Partners in Mission since 2008. She is a social worker by profession, graduated from University College Cork, Ireland. She worked in Ethiopia in community development for 16 years, empowering the girl child and young women through education and microfinance programs. As NGO representative to the UN, she collaborates across 70 countries where her organization is engaged with other NGOs in New York and on the global scene, re policy issues related to poverty eradication, human rights, ending prostitution and human trafficking, ending violence against women and girls, and the promotion of the girl child and integral ecology. She is a passionate advocate for gender equality and the implementation of universal social protection. Winifred, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Liana, and good afternoon to everybody. I really wanted to be on the first panel. But when I read the documentation closely, I discovered I was on the second panel. So, on reflection around the second panel, I found myself writing about national floors of social protection. And I'm talking here about floors, not ceilings, because I think this is a great example of an integrative policy approach to holistic well-being and sustainability. Social protection floors as an integrative policy approach is a policy that is human rights based, available across the life cycle, taking account of times when we experience threats to our personal or family well-being. Social protection provides universal access to, let me say, in policy and on paper, provides universal access to healthcare, including maternity care, income security for children, and there is talk at the moment about the whole issue of migrant children and migrants and whether they are entitled to social protection provided at a national level, and therefore maybe an answer to some of the issues that you have raised around children, to providing access to nutrition, education, care, and other necessary goods and services, basic income security for persons of active age who are unable to earn sufficient income due to sickness or unemployment, and maternity benefits and disability benefits, and basic income to people, to older persons in the form of pensions. While I say this, I am keenly aware that social protection is indeed a fundamental human right. And the achievement of universal social protection is on the global and national agendas. And yet, more than 4 billion people remain entirely unprotected. Holistic well-being and sustainability are intricately linked concepts that underscore the importance of considering the interconnectedness of human health, environmental health, and social equity. Integrative policy approach recognizes that addressing one aspect without considering its impact on others may lead indeed to short-term gains, but there are long-term consequences. Integrative social policy aims to promote health and wellness, not only for the individual, but also for the community, and indeed the planet as a whole. Integrative policy approaches recognize and honor relationships between human health and health of the environment. Policies designated with this perspective in mind prioritize actions that minimize harm to ecosystems. For example, reducing pollution, mitigating climate change, knowing that these are factors directly impacting human health. Another example, sustainable agriculture not only ensures food security, but also protects soil fertility and water resources, safeguarding the health of both people and planet. Integrative policy approaches are impacting the work of ILO as they revisit social protection policy to integrate more directly the planetary well-being dimension, reviewing environmental sustainability and decent work. Social protection is indeed at the heart of any just transition policy, and it plays a twofold role as I see it. First, it can be used to protect populations at increased risk of climate-related hardships, thus supporting adaptation efforts. Social protection benefits and services, many of which I've already mentioned, for example, healthcare and unemployment protection and employment guarantee schemes, can support individuals and households affected by extreme weather or slow onset events linked to climate change in coping with changing conditions. Many countries are adapting existing schemes or designing new ones to provide climate-responsive social protection for households at risk. And some of the literature I came across would point to what the Philippines did after the typhoon in 2013. Having social protection measures in place before the event occurs helps to expedite relief and is more cost efficient than responsive efforts designed and implemented only after the shock. And I think this is important in terms of forward planning. Secondly, social protection is essential to support individuals and households that are negatively affected by green policies, particularly if livelihoods are tied to unsustainable practices. Social protection provision can help those who lose their jobs, encounter restrictions on their livelihood activities, or who face higher prices for their essential energy needs. By offsetting the side effects of green policies, social protection contributes to their acceptability and to strengthening social consensus. Integrative policy approaches to holistic well-being and sustainability emphasize social justice and equity. It acknowledges that access to resources such as clean water and air, nutritious food, and safe living environments are essential for everyone to thrive. Policies aimed at promoting holistic well-being and sustainability should address disparities in access to these resources. By prioritizing equity and inclusivity, these policies foster resilient community that are better equipped to adapt to environmental and social challenges while promoting the well-being of all its members. So while we seek to heighten our awareness of living and behaving sustainably during this Sustainability Week, we are bombarded by death-dealing systems and structures that threaten us, humanity, and the planet. War, with its dreadful death tolls and its trauma-inducing impacts, is utterly destructive of well-being, destructive of the environment, jeopardizing humanity's future, and is irreconcilable with a sustainable future, centering individual, collective, and planetary well-being. The exploitative nature of neoliberal capitalism and corporate capture is indeed destructive of environment and people in the name of profit. Debt, climate change, and corporate capture are threats to human rights, to humanity, and the planet. Gender inequality, the demise of democracy, the limiting of civic space are challenges to holistic approaches for a sustainable future. Yet, the human spirit's drive and resilience in favor of life and life in its fullness is indomitable, unconquerable, unquenchable. And so in this week, we seek to be sustainable pioneers for the future. Indeed, another world is possible. And I want to end with the opening lines of a poem I discovered by Aurora Levins Morales. And I do, as part of my own well-being, enjoy poetry, and poetry in terms of nature. But I couldn't let this go when I came across it. I said it was for today. And so she writes, "Thus spoke the prophet, Rogue Dalton. Altogether, they have more death than we, but altogether, we have more life than they." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Winifred, for your insightful reflections as always, and for sharing on the second portion of the panel, and for connecting these issues to the need for universal social protection. As you said, social protection can be a powerful tool to promote the well-being of humans and the environment, and we know a better world is possible. And to Dr. Shapiro's point, all his and our time shouldn't be devoted to writing grants and desperately trying to find the resources to provide people with the basic services they need to be resilient, to drive sustainability. And social protection is a human right, as you said, not a privilege. And social protection services can and should be provided universally to ensure the well-being of all its members and the planet. And I also wanted to thank you for raising attention to how social protection can ensure just transitions for sustainable development. Ensuring just transitions, of course, is a central policy concern when we think about the connections between the well-being of people and the planet, but the concept hadn't been overtly mentioned yet during this discussion, and we would have been remiss to leave it out. So thank you again. I'd now like to open this discussion to a Q&A so the audience can engage with the panelists and vice versa. We'll take from the Zoom and from here in the room. Just send your questions in the Zoom chat or raise your hands. We'll need to be mindful of the time, so we'll take 4 questions to start, and then if we have time, we'll come back to the audience for more questions. So all that being said, does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask our panelists based on what they just heard?
So perhaps if I can direct this question to Dr. Shapiro specifically, I think a lot of what we're talking about well-being and mental health also means lending support to one another. Self-care is not something that we can do individually and alone, just self-serving, but it also means building a community around ourselves. So I'm curious, you shared a lot about your work and sort of where you hope that will lead and how you can spread that. You have a lot of advocacy practitioners right here in the room right now and online. I'm wondering if there might be some ideas that you can articulate about how some of us might be able to support you in that work. Also, given that a number of the people here in this room are members of the NGO Committee on Migration with a lot of intersection with the work that you do. So yeah, if there's any ideas you can give as to how we can support in our advocacy, the work that you do, it would be much appreciated.
I wish you gave me more time to think for an answer. That is a great question that I feel like I need to ponder a little more about, but like what comes to mind immediately is sort of what I said, where since we have like sort of a global community here, to really ponder the ideas of why children and families have to leave their countries in the first place. That's the original sin, really. I mean, there's probably more original sins that led to that, but let's just start with that when we think about the migration pathway and what children and families have to go through. So anything to mitigate that. And of course, climate change, climate disasters, war, all of those issues, and how each government contributes both in a good and bad way to those causes, I think is something that we all have to really take pause of and think about. Acknowledging that there's going to be ongoing migration, as there has been from the year dot, I think we have to think about how to improve pathways. And as a global community, right now, I'm caring for many, many families who have gone through the Darien Gap in Panama, who have made their way up through Central America and Mexico. I've had families that have been kidnapped whole. I have families that have had their children kidnapped. I have heard, really pretty horrendous stories. In fact, interestingly, a lot of the families are saying that the Darien Gap in Panama is less perilous than going through Mexico. And I just think we need to be really mindful of these migration pathways and to really advocate for improved safety along those routes. Without taking up too much time, I'm also thinking about what happens at the US border, like very specifically. And I think we have an upcoming election. I hate to get political, but it's hard not to. And I really worry about the rhetoric that we are hearing. We all, talk about sustainability and burnout. I mean, the work that we had to do to mitigate the effects of the Trump administration, which maybe reached its climax when children were separated from their families, and which our program very much dealt with. And I think really made the whole country, put the whole country up in arms about this policy. They're saying those were policy light compared to what's going to follow. And I worry about that greatly. I worry about ongoing policies of reception at the border. I'm currently working on a paper with the American Academy of Pediatrics to advocate for improved reception. And that really means that law enforcement does not take care of children and families when they arrive in the United States, and that it is left for child welfare and family welfare folks to take care of. And I think we have to advocate for those kind of policies. And I think we have to push back every time we hear dehumanizing language and dehumanizing immigration policies. And something I was going to say, but I didn't feel like I had the time, was to really change the narrative on who migrants are, what they contribute to our society, how much we actually need migrants, why they're here in the first place, and not to demonize and dehumanize them. So I think those are things that if this community can help focus on, we think about the whole world, but right here in the United States, I think we have a lot to learn. So I think that's what we could
Thank you.
help on.
I'm going to follow up from Katie's question. There were two things that struck me today was the triaging of workload. And I'm coming from a background in nursing, especially pediatrics, so it's interesting we're sitting together. But you talked about the trauma-informed support, and we often talk about that in terms of the people we work with. But I think actually organizations and communities, we all should be trauma-informed. Would you say something about that?
I feel like Katie would be better off talking about this than I. I am definitely not, listen, I think that I feel not that I feel very strong. I feel like our work is, in terms of trauma-informed care, does a better job with our families and children that we take care of, and probably a little less good job with our staff. And I just gonna admit that, and my staff would like say yes, to some degree. And so I think it's not perfect, and we have so much pressure. And so I would turn it over to Katie, because maybe you could answer better.
So just to say, you're not alone. We're not perfect at that either. It's something that I think I personally am really drawn to helping normalize the conversation amongst sort of advocacy and policy practitioners, because it's something that a lot of us in our advocacy will say, for example, on a topic by topic basis, we want to advocate for more mental health services for people on the move, for individuals who are living in or have been affected by conflict, for those who have experienced abuse of some form throughout their lives. But I really don't think we do a great job of addressing that within ourselves either, which is why I try and accept invitations like I got to this and share more of my own personal experience in dealing with it. And I think it's really important to keep in mind as well. I think we have this idea that there
Sorry, is it only me or did it freeze? Can anybody else hear? Is it frozen? Okay. Okay, I thought it was just
Yes,
me.
it's frozen. It's
Okay.
frozen.
I think someone typed that too. So I hope they notice that we can't hear them anymore. Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. I think we lost them, but hopefully they come back soon.
how instead of looking at someone and saying, what is wrong with you? Kind of saying, what happened to you? Or what might bring you to this space in this manner today? And we don't necessarily have to vocalize that, but also just internally granting people that space and recognizing we all might be going through different struggles at different times. So I guess that's my very long-winded way of saying, we have a long way to go in this community as well. And I'm just excited that there is a growing space for us to be able to speak more to that.
Thank you so much for sharing. Anyone else in the room would like to ask a question? Great, Isabel.
So I'd like to direct this question to Savita. The idea of inner transformation as being at the root cause of change is something that I've been grappling with more and more since I've entered the USA. So I was really glad that you talked about that. So of course, grassroots causes exist for all of the world's problems, but to what extent do you believe the maintenance of global conflict and unsustainability come down to the inner conflict and unsustainability of our world leaders? And how much can we really achieve as advocates if at the end of the day, the people making the decisions have not set aside time to pause for peace and make this inner transformation themselves?
The million-dollar question that we all have, right? And the challenge that we face also. And our organization has been affiliated to the UN since 1980. And so since 1980, we were trying to get this message across. I'm not sure how successful we are. And I'm sure many of you probably, if you're an NGO, probably would have been doing the same. But like I said, we shouldn't lose hope, because Mother Nature has really shown us who's in charge. You know, we try everything on the I'm generalizing here, right? Everything was tried on the external, and situations are just getting worse and worse, as we know. Hopefully, this is a signal. You know, like Katie is saying, we need to know and know when our triggers are being touched and trauma and all these things. So our thought is, we hope that governments are seeing all these things that are happening that are so wild. Everything is for the first time ever. This never happened before. This earthquake is the worst. This hurricane is the worst. And all of these things, hopefully, is touching them to make them realize that we need to do things differently. What we've been doing is not the only method. We have to address the external, but if we do not take care or look internally, how are we ever going to fix the external? You know, as they say, war is born in the minds of man. So if war is born in the minds of man, humans, right? Peace can also be born in the minds of humans. And so I would suggest that we don't give up. We know that if we really want transformation to take place, the sustainable transformation that we're all looking for, every one of us, it has to start from inside. Maybe because people are not sure when they look in, they might see anger or hatred or, you know, all these ugly things, and so they're scared to look inside, or maybe they don't want to address that, and it could be scary or painful. But there is support system, right? And we're all here to help support them. And so doing the work on ourselves is also a big support, that when they come to us, we can also help them. But like I mentioned, underneath all of that is the beauty, and so we have to help them to get there, because only when we change that shift. I don't even want to use the word change, because people are very scared change. You're like, no. So shift, you know, we need to bring that shift in. So it will happen from the grassroots. Lastly, you know, it starts from not just top down, but bottom up. So we meet in. I hope that's your question.
Thank you very much for sharing that reflection. Okay, last call for any questions for our panelists. Apologies to those of you online. It looks like the camera is having some technical difficulties here at the Baha'i International Community. Okay, well, then with that, I'll go ahead and close out the event. Oh, great.
I just also want to respond some little bit to your question, and in response to what I heard from you, Sabita. And there's something, and this comes even from my own experience of being Irish, there's something about how a people begin first with the family, and the family is individuals, but the family and the people, be they a local group or a national group, carry something of the hurts that have come from history. And so I talk out of my own experience of my family, and so the whole need for self-awareness, and like, why am I reacting this way? And some of this was shown to me myself in a dream where I was always on the run. And so, you know, I began to ask why, and it was asking different people why. They said, well, stop and think of your family. And the thing was, my family had a history of being involved in Irish guerrilla movements and all of that that went on. But like, I never had that dream again. Now, that was a powerful moment of coming to recognize that, like, we carry within ourselves. And now when I bring that and look at what's happening today and the whole situation of Israel and Palestine and Iran, and the word I hear constantly is retaliation. And like, it's so contrary to, I think, so much that we as a global community have done in terms of reconciliatory processes and reconciling and forgiving. And so it seems to me as if a people are caught in this moment of wanting to retaliate. So something often happened to me. I do worse to my neighbor who perpetrated it. Somebody else steps in and does something. The global community stepped in to, I think, try and mitigate some of that damage. And yet we're still on the drive to want to retaliate. So how, and it's not that the whole people, like there are, I think, pockets of people within every culture group that the consciousness has come. But how and are we invited to be, and I think this is some of the processes that you brought up, Savita, how to be in that space that is contradictory without ourselves contributing to the aggro that's already there. And then, like, you come to talk about, I'll finish here, systems and structures. And as somebody already mentioned, greed and selfishness and apathy. I wrote it down here in my own notes. I don't know who mentioned it, but these are powerful drivers within the human that are not for the good of the community. And so how be where those drives are happening, the corporate capture, and you look at the whole child labor, human trafficking, and the profits that are made, the agribusiness and the food insecurity, all of this. And so, like, I think much of the drive here in this community of NGOs is to try and tackle those systems and structures. So just you know, you sparked it and you sparked it as speaker. So I'm just putting that out there in terms of.
And if I may add, our first speaker there, she mentioned that faith leaders, I think, or just faith need to be at the table. You know, because in order to implement that, the policies have to change, but the policy makers also have to understand, right, that it all starts from up here, but who's going to help them to know that we are in this together, you know, and we have to do this together because we are all impacted together, you know. So, yeah.
Go ahead.
So some of the things you said made me just think of what happened with separated children, right? Where, so the point that first going to come out is this idea that you need the general public to respond. Like, you need, the government leaders need to see that that the majority of the population is against whatever harmful thing is happening, and in some ways, I think. And without being too naive about this, sitting in the UN. But I, you know, think about an example. So first of all, when I grew up, like, protest was the way you responded. There was no social media, it wasn't in the ether, it was right there on the street. It stopped traffic, it stopped whatever, you know, you were trying to stop. And there was maybe not 100% effectiveness, but I think there was some effectiveness in that, in those peaceful protests. But I'm thinking of more recently when children were separated from their families in 20. I believe it was, that, you know, the country responded forcefully and went out and protested against that practice, and it ended within months. At least it ended on paper within months. And that was very effective. And I wonder about other forms of protest that have to come from the general public. And I feel like if you took all the Israelis and all the Gazans, then most of them, the vast majority would want to see what's happening today. And I don't think we hear that voice as much as we need to. And I don't think we hear that voice as much as they need to stop these things from happening. Hopefully that was probably it. Thank you.
Recording in progress.
Okay, we're back up on TV for the end. I see here online that Beth has her hand raised. I think she wanted to make a comment. So Beth, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Leanna. Can folks hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. I just wanted to affirm what the good doctor was saying about the US-Mexico border and the treatment of migrants and the challenges of the organizations like ours, the Loreto community that is trying to, the group's trying to assist migrants. And so just wanted to affirm that and thank all of you for a wonderfully inspiring and informative and enriching program, very, very timely. And for those folks, especially the folks who are excited about the first panel and want to continue with more, there is a program, it's virtual, and I put it in the chat. So hopefully that will be distributed from today's event. It's co-sponsored by Kringo, the Committee of Religious NGOs, and AHAM Education. It'll be happening this Thursday from 2 to 3:30 p.m. and it's called Healing Ourselves and Healing the Planet, Interfaith, Indigenous, and Embodied Approaches to Climate Action. It will feature a brand new documentary put together by AHAM Education that was premiered at COP28. And it will be a lovely interfaith gathering for us to take a break and instead of retaliate, meditate. Hope to see some of you there.
Great. Thank you very much, Beth. I'm definitely interested in attending that discussion and thinking about similar themes in new ways. And with that, we are out of time and it's time to close out our discussion today. So I'd like to thank all of our speakers one more time for coming together to share your experiences and perspectives. When we first envisioned this discussion, we really wanted to simultaneously bring the conversation around sustainability down to the individual and turn it inward and create a space for each of us here in the room and online to think about our own well-being from a holistic perspective and a trauma-informed approach. But we also wanted to bring the individual to the global stage, as we always do in our advocacy work, and have a discussion which highlights the ways in which the individual, the collective, the global, and the environment are all interconnected. And I think we've certainly accomplished that here today, thanks to the unique insights shared by each of our panelists and by the questions asked by our attendees. And so thank you too to all of our attendees for being here today, despite very busy schedules. Please keep in touch and we hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your week filled with many fruitful sessions, whether it's for UN Sustainability Week or the EcoSoc Youth Forum or the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, among others. So thank you again.
Any questions?